I had been tracking 3 stray yearlings since first light, when I saw her lying in the pale dust near the roots of a cottonwood long dead from drought. At first I thought it was the hide of some animal curled and stiff in the cold air. But then the wind shifted, and I caught sight of her hair, dark, tangled, and still enough to make me wonder if she was breathing. My mare halted on her own ears forward, as though she sensed something I hadn't yet put a name to. The gully was quiet, but for the groan of the wind against the bluff. It was a place you passed through, not lingered in, yet here she was, left out where the night could finish what the day had started. I eased down from the saddle, not knowing yet if I'd offer help or walk away. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a moment where one choice could alter the course of your days. My name's Silas Gentry, and I've worked cattle on this stretch of Arizona territory since the spring of '75, after the war had taken enough from me that there was no reason to go back east. I built my cabin with my own hands, every log dragged in from the ridge, every board nailed tight against the wind. My wife Clara had come with me, and for a short while, the place was more than 4 walls. It was home. She took sick during our first hard winter, and by the time the thaw came, I was the only one left to tend the stock. That was 7 years ago. Life since then had been quiet, steady, the way a man gets used to when he's got no one to answer to but the seasons. I rose before sunup, kept my fences mended, my herd fed, and my hands busy. Sundays I might ride into Briar Hollow for supplies, or stand in the back of the little clapboard church, not so much for the sermon as for the sound of voices in one place. Folks knew me well enough to nod, but I wasn't one to linger in town. I'd seen too much talk turn sour over land claims, cattle prices, and who owed who from last winter's feed. The land here doesn't give much unless you work for it. Water's scarce winters bite through wool, and a man's word means more than the coins in his pocket. I'd learned to keep mine, whether it was to a neighbor or to myself. But the town was changing. The railroad talk brought in speculators with polished boots and quicker tongues than I trusted. They saw the open stretches as profit, not pasture, and every acre had a price to them. Out here on the fringes, I'd managed to keep clear of their deals so far. That morning in late February, I'd set out with nothing on my mind but finding those strays before coyotes did. The frost was still on the ground, and the air carried that sharp edge that makes a man think spring's near, even when it isn't. I'd followed the hoofprints down into Dry River Wash, figuring they'd gone looking for water that wasn't there. I was ready to find bones, or buzzards, not someone breathing, half buried in dust and ash. She didn't move when I first saw her, and I didn't move either. Just stood there, the reins slack in my hand, listening to the wind scrape against the rocks. The yearlings could wait. There was something in the way she'd been left that made it clear she hadn't gotten here by accident. I took one slow step toward her, then another, until the distance between us was gone and there was nothing left to do but decide. The cold in that gully had a way of settling into your bones. I could feel it through my coat as I stood over her, the mare shifting behind me, hooves crunching in the thin crust of frost. She was small under all that ash, but I could tell the heat radiating from her skin wasn't the kind you wanted in winter. Fever like that out here could take a body quick. I slid my coat from my shoulders and set it in the dust beside me, then worked loose the buttons of my flannel. The wind cut against my bare chest, sharp enough to sting, but I didn't waste time thinking about it. I draped the shirt over her, covering her shoulders first, then pulling the tails down over her ribs and hips. She didn't stir when I slid my arms beneath her. The weight of her was almost nothing like carrying a half-grown fawn. Her legs hung limp, bare, skin cold, under the torn scrap of hide she'd been left in. I rose slow, letting my back take the weight, and stepped toward the wagon. The slope of the wash was loose with sand and stone, but the mare followed steady ears, twitching at the sound of the harness rings. By the time I laid her on the old horse blanket in the wagon bed, my hands were stiff from the cold. I pulled another scrap of canvas over her and climbed onto the bench. The trail north to my place was 3 miles of open ground, nothing but low sage and scattered rock until the cottonwoods by the creek. I kept the horse to a steady walk, the creak of the wheels and the leather traces the only sound under the wind. I didn't look back often, but when I did, her face was half hidden in her hair, the ash still caked along her collarbones. She hadn't moved. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dropping behind the ridge, long shadows stretching from the barn toward the cabin. I reined in at the barn door, climbed down, and went to open the cabin. Inside was cold, but dry. 1-room plank floor, stone hearth table with 2 chairs, though only one had seen use in years. I lit the lamp, stirred the fire back to life, and set a few dry logs so the heat would hold. When I lifted her from the wagon, she made a sound, a thin, broken noise that barely reached her lips and let her head fall against my chest. I carried her straight inside and set her on the cot, drawing the blanket over her until only her face showed. Up close, the bruises on her arms and ribs told more than the ash did. Someone had meant her to carry both pain and shame. I fetched water from the barrel, filled a basin, and wet a clean rag. The moment the damp cloth touched her forehead, her body flinched like she'd been struck. I pulled back a second, then set the cloth again, slower this time, until her breathing eased. "You're safe here," I said low, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. The words felt more like a thing I needed to hear out loud. I left her to rest and set beans to boil coffee over the coals. The light faded to black outside and the wind quieted. I spread a wool blanket on the floor by the hearth, rolled my coat for a pillow, and stayed there. I didn't sleep much. Each time she shifted or let out a muffled sound, I lifted my head to check the door, listening to the walls creak in the cold. Sometime near midnight, she cried out. It was quick, sharp, the kind of sound that comes from deeper than the throat. Her arms twitched under the blanket, her face turned to the wall. I didn't wake her, just sat watching the fire until the coals settled to red. By morning, the fever still hadn't broken, but her breathing was steady. I fed the horse, carried in more wood, and left a tin cup of water wrapped in cloth near her hand. I didn't try to speak. She might understand me, she might not, but it didn't matter yet. I let the day pass quiet, tending to what needed doing outside. When I came back near midday, the cot was empty. I stopped in the doorway, my hand still on the latch. She was crouched in the corner, wrapped in the blanket with my shirt hanging loose on her frame, eyes dark and watchful. She held the cup in both hands, drinking in short, careful swallows. Her cheeks were flushed, but her gaze followed me the way a wild thing watches for the first sign of trouble. I moved slow toward the table, set down a piece of jerky, and went to work mending a harness. By the time I looked again, the bread I'd left earlier was gone. The next days passed in the same slow rhythm. She stayed near the walls, slept light, and paced in the dark when the fire burned low. Twice I found her crouched near the door before dawn, the blanket tight around her eyes, fixed on the latch. She never asked where she was, never tried to leave. I kept my hands busy with the stock and the tools, always making my movements steady, nothing sudden. On the third afternoon, I was slicing jerky at the table when I heard her voice. It was quiet, almost like she was testing the air. "Sia." I looked up, but she didn't repeat it or meet my eyes. Her hands were busy with a needle and a scrap of my old linen stitching, something loose and wide. My shirt still hung from her shoulders, slipping low when she moved. She didn't seem to mind now, but I could tell she wanted something of her own. "Sia," I said back, and after a pause she gave the smallest nod. That evening the table had been wiped, the hearth swept, and the beans I'd left were warm over the fire. She sat near the pot with her legs folded beneath her, still wrapped in the blanket, but no longer keeping her distance from the space itself. By lamplight, her face looked clearer, the soot gone from her skin, the bruises fading to yellow at the edges. She'd cut some tangles from her hair, though the charred beads remained woven in the braids. She wasn't whole yet, but she no longer looked like she was waiting for the end. That night, as she curled near the fire, her eyes moved to the shelf by my cot, where an old tobacco tin and a small wrapped parcel sat. She didn't touch them, but I noticed the look. It told me she was starting to take stock of where she was. In the morning, I left for half the day to check the southern fence, making it clear I'd be gone. When I came back, the fire was still going. The cabin swept, and on the table was the finished garment, a loose top of patched linen. That evening she wore it. She'd bathed her hair still damp, her skin free of the ash and dust. The bruises were lighter, her posture straighter. The shirt hung long over her hips, not hiding her completely, but it was hers now. When she passed me a cup of coffee, her fingers brushed mine and neither of us moved away. The air had turned colder again, frost gathering before sunrise. Still, she began rising not long after I did, moving quiet through the room, sweeping, tending the fire, folding blankets. One morning I stepped in from the barn with a bucket of milk and found her sweeping in a dress she'd pieced together from my old shirts and spare canvas. For a moment she met my gaze, holding it, before turning back to her work. Later that same day, I noticed she'd woven 3 of the blackened beads back into her braid. It told me she wasn't forgetting where she came from, only changing what it meant to her. That afternoon, she followed me to the barn, without a word, watching as I repaired a stall door. After a while, she stepped forward to hold a board steady while I drove the nail. Her hands were calloused now, her grip sure. As the sun dropped in a haze of gold across the plains, she stirred the beans inside while I cut kindling. When we sat to eat, I poured her coffee without asking, and she took it without hesitation. A quiet ease had settled between us, the kind that doesn't need words to hold. But that night, as we sat on the porch bench and the wind lifted the loose ends of her braid, she leaned her head against my shoulder and asked her first real question. "Why did you help me?" It wasn't sharp, just steady. I thought a moment before answering. Because no one else did. She nodded once, like that was all she needed to know. Inside, the fire burned low, and the room held a different kind of silence than it had a week before. I didn't know yet what would come next, but it was clear we'd both stepped onto a trail neither of us had planned to ride. The days that followed settled into a quiet pattern. Morning light crept in pale through the single window, catching the smoke as it curled from the hearth. Sia moved through the cabin like someone still half expecting to be sent away. She kept to the walls, her steps light on the plank floor, and her eyes tracked the door each time the wind rattled it. She rose earlier now, just after I stepped in from the barn, and by then the fire was always burning steady, the blankets folded neat at the foot of the cot. She'd found ways to make herself useful without my asking. The oil lamp shone brighter after she cleaned the glass, the table stayed clear of the thin layer of dust that used to gather in the corners, and the floor bore the marks of her sweeping each day. She worked with a deliberate hand, never hurried, but never idle either. There was a steadiness to her that matched the slow rhythm of the land in winter. One morning as I came in with the bucket of milk, I saw her at the shelf by the wall. She wasn't rifling through it, just looking. The tobacco tin and the small cloth-wrapped bundle sat there, same as they had for years. She didn't touch either one, only glanced at them before turning back to the stove. It wasn't mistrust in her eyes, just a quiet taking in of her surroundings, as if she was mapping out the edges of her new place. That afternoon, I worked in the shed mending a length of rawhide. When I turned, she was standing at the doorway holding out the knife I'd left near the firewood pile. "You left this," she said simply. It was the first time she'd spoken since telling me her name. Her voice was low but steady, and she didn't linger for an answer. She left the blade on the workbench and stepped back into the yard braid, swinging against the patched linen shirt she'd made from my scraps. By late February, the wind sharpened again. Frost formed on the troughs before dawn, and the cabin boards groaned in the cold. Still, she came with me to the barn one afternoon, without a word, carrying a bucket as if it had always been part of her day. She stood just behind me while I hammered a stall board into place, then stepped forward to hold it steady while I set the nail. Her hands were firmer now, the skin toughened, and she met my glance without dropping her eyes. Evenings were different than they had been that first week. We sat at the table together now, her on one side, me on the other, the beans and bread between us. She took the coffee I poured her without hesitation, and when she passed me the salt tin, her hand brushed mine just enough to notice. It wasn't deliberate, but it stayed in my mind long after we'd cleared the bowls. The nights were still cold enough to draw us close to the fire. She sat on the floor with her legs tucked under her, mending a shirt sleeve or tying cord from the hides she'd worked earlier in the day. Sometimes she hummed under her breath, a sound so faint it almost vanished into the crackle of the wood. I didn't ask about the tune. She didn't ask about the tobacco tin or the bundle on the shelf. There was a kind of unspoken agreement between us to leave some things untouched, at least for now. Toward the end of the month, she surprised me again. I came in from checking the fence line to find a small figure carved from bone sitting at the center of the table. The work was simple, the edges smoothed by a careful hand. "For the grave," she said quietly when I picked it up. She didn't say Clara's name, but I knew she'd noticed the wooden cross behind the barn. Without speaking, I stepped outside with the carving, and she followed. The ground there was still hard from the cold, a thin frost lying over the pine needles. I knelt at the head of the mound, cleared the needles from the base of the cross, and set the carving just beneath it. She stood beside me, hands folded in front of her, the wind lifting a loose strand of hair from her braid. We stayed that way for a moment, then turned back toward the cabin. That night, the air inside felt different. Not lighter exactly, but more settled. As she swept the hearth, I went to the shelf and took down the cedar box I hadn't opened in years. She stopped, broom still in hand, and watched as I set it on the table. I opened the lid and took out a plain copper ring. "This was Clara's," I said. "She told me once to give it to someone who could wear it." I set it on the table, not pushing it toward her. "If you want it?" She stepped forward and looked at the ring for a long moment. "I'm not her," she said. "I know I told her I don't want what I had before. I want what I have now." She picked up the ring, slid it onto her finger. It fit loose, but she didn't seem to mind. "Then I stay," she said. The next morning, we built a second chair. She helped me measure the boards, laughed when I miscounted a notch, and sanded the edges after I nailed the frame. By sundown, it sat opposite mine at the table, the fire throwing shadows across both. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, but for the first time in years, I didn't glance toward the door as if expecting it to open to trouble. She didn't either. She just reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and held on. Early March brought longer days, though the wind still carried the kind of chill that cut through cloth. The snow on the north slope of the ridge had melted into shallow streams, and the creek behind the barn ran just enough to make a soft noise over the stones. By then, Sia moved through the cabin with the assurance of someone who knew where things belonged. She still worked quiet, but the caution in her steps had eased. Most mornings we started the day together without speaking. I would carry in wood while she set the coffee pot on the stove. Her patched dress hung easier on her frame, now the linen soft from use. She had begun weaving blue thread into her braid, the color catching in the lamplight when she bent over her work. I never asked where she found the thread, but I noticed she used it sparingly, saving the rest for later. One morning after breakfast, she stepped out from behind the table holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I made something," she said, and set it in my hands. Inside was a small shirt, the stitches uneven, but tighter than before. It was far too small for either of us. I looked from the shirt to her face, and she met my eyes. "It's not certain yet," she said quietly, "but I think it is." Her hand went to her stomach, resting there lightly. We stood without speaking for a moment, the stove ticking behind us. "You sure?" I asked. She nodded once. "I've missed one moon, and my body feels different." I set the shirt on the table, stepped forward, and placed my palm over hers. She covered my hand with her other one, her fingers warm against my skin. That week we rode into Briar Hollow together. It had been almost a year since I'd walked those boardwalks with company. She sat beside me in the wagon, her chin high, the braid with the blue thread resting over her shoulder. The townsfolk watched as we passed, some just looking, some speaking low to each other. But she didn't slow her steps when we reached the mercantile. Inside, I bought flour coffee and a length of rope. She chose ribbon needles and a pair of soft-soled boots. No one said much, but the glances told enough. The ride back was quiet, the wind moving over the open ground. She leaned against me in the wagon bed, eyes half closed. "You don't regret this?" she asked. All the things people might think, I kept my gaze on the trail ahead. "I regret not meeting you sooner." She didn't answer, but her hand found mine under the blanket, and she kept it there until we turned up the rise toward the cabin. At home, she unpacked the supplies while I checked the wagon wheel. That evening, we ate on the porch as the sky turned orange and purple over the ridge. The cattle moved slow in the pasture, their shapes dark against the grass. She slipped the copper ring from her finger, held it out to me, and said, "You never asked." I slid it back on, slow and deliberate. "I don't need a preacher," she whispered. "Just you." I looked at her steady. "Then, you have me." The next morning, she stood in the doorway with her hand over her stomach. I walked up behind her, slid an arm around her waist, and placed my hand beside hers. Outside, the sapling behind the cabin had pushed out 2 new leaves. Inside, the 2 chairs sat by the fire, the blankets folded neat. In the weeks that followed, the air grew warmer, and the snowmelt gave way to fresh grass along the fence lines. She checked the sapling each morning, brushing the dry soil away from the roots, pouring a cup of water at its base. She never hurried the work. The way she tended it reminded me of how she moved through the cabin, careful and deliberate, making each space her own. One afternoon, I came in from the barn to find her sewing at the table. The fabric was pale cut from an old shirt of mine she'd set aside weeks ago. She looked up when I entered, but didn't stop her work. "This is for you," she said. When it was finished, she handed me the shirt. The sleeves were a little uneven, but it fit, and when she smoothed the collar at my neck, she said, "You look like yourself." That night, she sat by the hearth, the firelight soft on her face. The copper ring caught the glow each time she turned her hand. The sound of the wind outside was steady, not harsh. It had been months since the day I found her in the wash, but I still remembered the ash on her skin, the bruises along her ribs. Now she stood with her back straight, her steps sure on the floorboards. Spring was coming on fast, but the land still carried a chill after sunset. We took to sitting outside in the evenings, her braid brushing against my shoulder when the breeze picked up. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. One night, as the light faded and the first stars came out, she said I chose to stay. "You didn't ask me to." I nodded. I wouldn't. It was the first time I'd heard her say it plain without the weight of caution behind the words. It told me that whatever road had brought her here, she wasn't looking back. By late March, the grass along the creek had greened enough to bring the herd in close without much coaxing. The air warmed in the afternoons, but the mornings still held frost in the shaded draws. Sia had taken to joining me for the early rounds, walking the fence line, or carrying water to the barn without waiting to be asked. Her stride was sure now, her boots leaving a steady line of prints beside mine in the damp soil. That week she began spending more time in the garden bed behind the cabin. The ground was still cold beneath the top layer, but she worked it with a short-handled hoe, breaking the clumps and setting them in neat rows. I watched from the porch, once the sun just clearing the ridge, as she straightened to push a loose strand of hair from her cheek. The blue thread in her braid caught the light bright against the dark plait. She noticed me, then, holding my gaze for a breath before bending back to the work. Inside the cabin had changed in quiet ways. The shelves were organized, the table covered with a strip of cloth she'd sewn herself, and bundles of dried sage hung above the hearth. The scent was faint but constant, mingling with the smell of coffee each morning. She mended shirts without my asking and folded them into the pine crate by the wall, edges aligned, as if each one had its place. One afternoon, I was in the barn, repairing a cracked stirrup when Sia stepped in. She didn't say anything, just held out a small parcel wrapped in hide. I wiped my hands on a rag before taking it. Inside was a carving made from bone, a woman kneeling, her head bowed. For Clara, she said, her voice steady. I hadn't told her much about the grave behind the barn, but she must have seen me pass it enough times to know. We walked there together. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, rattling the last dry leaves that clung to the branches. I knelt at the head of the mound, brushed away the pine needles, and set the figure at the base of the cross. She stood beside me with her hands folded, her eyes on the carving. We didn't speak, and after a while we turned back toward the cabin. That night the fire burned low as Sia swept near the hearth. I went to the shelf above my cot and brought down the cedar box I'd kept there for years. She stopped sweeping, watching as I set it on the table. I opened it and took out the plain copper ring. This was Clara's, I said. She told me to give it to someone who could wear it. I laid it on the table without pushing it toward her. If you want it. She looked at it for a long moment before saying, I'm not her. I met her eyes. I don't want what I had before. I want what I have now. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit a little loose, but she didn't seem to mind. Then I stay, she said. From that day, the cabin felt less like mine alone. We built a second chair for the table, measuring and cutting the boards together. She laughed when I miscounted the notches, shaking her head as she sanded the edges smooth. By sundown, the two chairs sat side by side, their shadows long against the wall. April brought softer air and longer evenings. We ate outside more often, watching the sky change over the ridge. Sometimes she braided her hair while sitting on the porch, handing me the end to tie off when she was done. It became a quiet habit between us, one that didn't need words. One evening, as we sat together with coffee, she spoke in a tone that left no room for doubt. What they took wasn't mine to give. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. I answered, just as plain. I didn't save you for that. She gave a small nod. I know. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere far off. She rested her hand on mine. I chose to stay, she said. You didn't ask me to. I held her gaze for a moment. I wouldn't. That night, when the lamps were turned low and the fire burned to coals, she crossed the room and took my hand. There was no ceremony in it, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of someone who had decided where she belonged. By morning, nothing in the cabin had changed, but the space between us had. She moved through her chores as usual. I went about mine. Yet every glance carried a thread that hadn't been there before. And outside, the sapling behind the cabin stood a little taller, its leaves catching the early light. By the time April pushed into its second week, the wind had softened, carrying the smell of wet earth from the creek bed. The pasture grass was thickening, and the herd grazed closer to the cabin without the need for pushing. Sia's steps had become part of the morning sound, the soft tread of her boots on the plank floor as she moved toward the stove, the clink of the coffee pot lid. That Saturday, I was repairing a loose hinge on the shed when she came from behind the cabin with a basket. She'd been gathering early shoots along the creek, pale roots wrapped in a damp cloth. She crouched beside me, setting the basket down, and without a word began sorting the pieces on a clean rag. The sun caught the blue thread in her braid, and for a moment she looked up, meeting my eyes, before turning back to her work. The days fell into a pattern that felt almost like seasons turning. We split the chores without talking about it. I mended fences and saw to the cattle while she kept the cabin and garden in order. In the evenings, we often sat on the porch, her working a length of cord or sewing a seam, me nursing a cup of coffee. One afternoon, as I came in from hauling feed, I found her standing at the table with the copper ring in her hand. "I thought about giving this back," she said, her voice even. "But it belongs here now." She slid it onto her finger again, twisting it once before setting her hand flat on the table. I didn't speak, but I knew she didn't need an answer. We took the wagon into Briar Hollow later that week for supplies. It was the first trip into town since the snow had melted off the ridge. The main street was busier than winter had left it, with wagons lined outside the mercantile and the sound of a hammer striking from the blacksmith shop. We stepped inside and the talk quieted just enough to notice. Sia moved beside me, her chin high, the hem of her dress brushing her boots. She chose a length of cotton cloth, a new needle, and a small tin of buttons. I bought coffee lamp oil and 2 sacks of feed. On the ride home, the air was still warm from the day. She sat turned toward the west, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. "It's different here," she said after a while. "The quiet." I nodded. "It's the kind that stays." She didn't reply, but she shifted closer, her shoulder resting lightly against my arm, until we turned into the yard. By May, the garden rows were set, and the sapling behind the cabin had leaves enough to stir in the breeze. Sia checked it each morning, pressing the soil at its base and pouring a tin cup of water over the roots. She had taken to wearing her hair in a single braid most days, though some evenings she left it loose, the strands catching the lamplight when she bent over her sewing. One such evening, I brought in a bucket of water from the creek and found her at the table with another bundle. She pushed it toward me. "For you," she said. Inside was a shirt, the stitching straighter than her first attempts months ago. It fit well enough, and when she adjusted the collar, she said quietly, "Now you look like you belong here." We sat outside after supper, the light fading to a thin gold over the hills. She rested her hand on her stomach, the gesture now as natural as breathing. I glanced at her, and she caught my look. "I feel stronger," she said, "like it's holding on." I didn't need to ask what she meant. As the air cooled, the cattle drifted toward the lower pasture, and a hawk circled above the far fence line. The sound of hooves carried faintly from the trail beyond the creek. I stood listening, the hair on my neck lifting just enough to know it wasn't one of ours. The rhythm was steady, a single rider closing in. Sia rose from the bench, her hand still resting on her stomach. We stood together in the last of the light, watching the trail. The rider came into view as a dark shape against the fading sky, moving slow but sure toward the cabin. The rider came slow up the trail, dust lifting behind the hooves. When he reached the yard, he drew back on the reins and touched a hand to his hat. The man was in his early 50s, lean-faced with a gray mustache and eyes that didn't flinch. "Name's Sheriff Cal Renshaw," he said. "Mind if I step down?" I nodded toward the porch, and he swung from the saddle with the ease of someone long in the saddle. Sia stayed a step behind me, her hand light on my arm. The sheriff's boots sounded heavy on the porch boards. He asked for a seat, and I brought out a chair. He rested his hat on his knee, speaking in a measured tone. "I've been up from Dry Creek on account of some talk in town. Word is there's an Apache woman staying out here with you." He glanced toward Sia, not unkindly. "I reckon that's no crime, but it's got some folks stirred." Sia held his gaze without speaking. I told him she had a place here, that she'd harmed no one and owed nothing to anyone in town. Renshaw listened, then leaned back. "Trouble is," he said, "there's a man come into Dry Creek 2 days back asking after her. Said his name's Elias Crow. Claims she's his property by arrangement of her kin." The air between us tightened. Sia's fingers pressed harder into my sleeve. I asked what business Crow had, and the sheriff said he was camped east of the river, waiting on a word. I've seen men like him, Renshaw added quietly. They don't leave easy. I offered him coffee and we spoke a while longer. He promised to send a telegraph to the county judge in Red Bluff to confirm if Crow had any rightful claim. Before he mounted up, he told Sia, "You've got the right to stay where you're safe. I'll do what I can." That night, Sia moved quieter than usual, setting plates on the table without a word. I watched her over the lamplight, the shadows softening the line of her cheek. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Crow was with the men who came for me before. If he's here, he won't stop." I told her the sheriff meant his word, and so did I. The next morning, I rode into Briar Hollow for supplies. The air was sharp with early frost, though the sun was climbing. At the Mercantile, I caught a whisper or two as I passed talk of the girl at Gentry's place and the drifter in from nowhere. I kept my temper, bought what we needed, and headed home. By the time I reached the cabin, Sia was in the garden hoe in hand. She looked up and I saw she hadn't been idle. The rows were neat, the young shoots standing straight. "Sheriff came back," she said, setting the hoe aside. "He left this." She held out an envelope, my name written in a firm hand. Inside was a note. "Judge arrives Friday. Keep her close." We spent the next days tending chores close to home. Each evening I checked the far fence line and the trail from the ridge. Once, just before dusk, I saw smoke from a small camp east of the river. Sia saw it too. She didn't speak, but she stayed near the cabin after that. On Friday morning, the sound of wheels carried up from the road. A buggy rolled into view, driven by Sheriff Renshaw. Beside him sat a man in a dark coat, tall and spare, with a satchel at his feet. "Judge Abram Cole, come from Red Bluff. We met in the yard." The judge shook my hand. Then Sia's, his grip firm. "Sheriff tells me there's a claim to settle," he said. "We'll hear it proper before I leave." Renshaw went to fetch Crow from his camp. Sia stood beside me, her shoulders square, the breeze catching the braid down her back. She didn't ask to go inside. She stayed where she was, eyes fixed on the bend in the road. When they returned, Crow rode at an easy pace, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the cabin, the yard, the garden rows. He slid from his horse with a practiced smile. "You've kept her well," he said, his voice like gravel. The judge motioned us toward the porch. "We'll have words here," he said. The boards creaked under our weight as we took our places. Sia remained standing, her chin lifted. Crow claimed she'd been promised to him as payment for a debt that her kin had signed over her labor until the sum was met. Judge Cole listened without interrupting, then asked for proof. Crow produced a paper, the edges worn. The judge read it, his brow furrowing. He asked Sia if she recognized the marks at the bottom. She shook her head. "That's not my hand, nor the hand of anyone I call kin," she said. Renshaw stepped forward, saying the paper had no seal, no witness, and was worth less than the ink on it. Crow's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The judge folded the paper, tucked it into his coat, and stood. "You've no rightful claim here," he told Crow. "You'll take your leave of this territory." Crow's eyes cut toward Sia, but he kept his voice smooth. "You'll see me again," he said. Then he turned, mounted, and rode off down the trail without looking back. The judge shook my hand once more, telling me to keep her safe. Renshaw tipped his hat to Sia. As the buggy rolled away, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the yard. Sia let out a slow breath, her hand brushing mine before she stepped toward the porch. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone hawk wheeled against the sky. When the judge's buggy disappeared over the ridge, the yard felt still again. Sia stood for a moment, her eyes fixed on the road, then turned toward the cabin. I followed her up the steps, the boards giving their familiar creak under our boots. Inside, the lamplight was warm against the gathering dusk. She moved quietly about the room, setting the coffee pot on the stove, her braid brushing her back. I could see a change in her, not the absence of fear exactly, but the weight of it was lighter now. Over the next weeks, we settled into the kind of rhythm a man doesn't plan, but finds himself grateful for. The mornings were cool, the fields damp with dew. Sia would hum while tending the garden rows, her voice low and steady. I worked the fences, mended what winter had loosened, and found myself listening for that sound. Sheriff Renshaw stopped by once to say Crow had been seen heading north toward the Montana line. "Don't reckon he'll be back," he told us, and for the first time Sia smiled without a shadow in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it felt like the sun breaking through after a long storm. By early summer, the cabin and land showed the mark of two sets of hands working side by side. The porch rails were sanded smooth, the corral straightened, the garden heavy with green. At the church social in Briar Hollow, folks who once looked away now tipped their hats to Sia, and she met them with quiet dignity. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the last light fade, Sia spoke. "You gave me more than a place to stay," she said. "You gave me back my name." The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of wild sage, and I told her she'd done the same for me, in ways she might never know. The frontier had its rough edges, it always would. But in that moment I understood that justice wasn't only about what a judge declared or a sheriff enforced. It was about the choice to stand beside someone when it would be easier to walk away. Out here you learn that a home is built as much from trust as from timber, and kin can be found where you least expect them. I reckon that's a lesson worth holding on to. If you've listened this far, take a moment to remember the folks who've stood by you when the trail turned hard, and maybe be that person for someone else.